Hello. We've talked in recent videos about the dominance of the Red Bull RB19 and its remarkable performance we've seen in the first three races. And I think teams are going to be working pretty hard in their factories trying to work out how they're going to close that performance gap. But before they can do that, one of the key things they need to understand is just what is it that makes the RB19 such a good car. So joining me today, we've got our two resident tech experts, Matt Somerfield and Jake Boxall-Legge, to try and give some insight into just what is it that gives Red Bull those legs at the moment. Lots to digest after the first three races, and I think a lot for other teams to look at, especially with, just what is it that Red Bull is doing so great. So start with you, Matt. People always talk about Red Bull's aero strength, the input of Adrian Newey as being one of its core edges. But I think one thing we've seen from these first races, isn't it, that it's not just aero that's made the RB19 so strong.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned him, I think there's that assumption because they've got Adrian Newey on board that, that's the core aspect of why their cars are so quick. But there's a huge amount of people at Red Bull that are critical in the design of the car, and it's not just aerodynamics that you have to concentrate on. You've got to think about the power unit, the suspension, the brakes, the chassis. A whole host of other performance-related factors are involved in making a great car. And so, it's not just the aerodynamics. There's plenty more going on behind the scenes as well.
I think what's been fairly obvious from fans watching the races is the straight line speed advantage of the Red Bull. We saw Max Verstappen blast past Lewis Hamilton in the Australian Grand Prix, and even in Saudi, we heard Lewis talk about the Red Bull being the fastest car he's ever seen anyone ever have in Formula One in terms of that top speed edge. Jake, why is that Red Bull DRS so good? And as a kind of car design concept, how do you engineer having a one DRS that's brilliant and another DRS that doesn't give you such advantage?
It's all in how you kind of shape that general, that main plane wing element, the top level wing element that the DRS affects. Because when you consider that, it's got to work in two mode cases. It's got to work at its maximum when it's down and you're just trying to derive downforce from the rear wing. But it's also got to work properly when the DRS is activated. And so you've got to create a design that is good on both fronts. It's all about what, wing angle you kind of optimize for. You're going to work pretty hard in your simulations to try and work out what's the best wing angle to have when you're applying DRS, because you've got an 85 millimeter gap that you're allowed. And it's also in the shape of the airfoil profile. If you look, for example, at a wing side on, it's got a certain degree of camber, it's got a certain chord length, it's got a certain thickness to it. And it's all in how you're able to kind of concoct that aerofoil shape, what you're looking for to try and ensure that you've got as little drag as possible when DRS is activated, but also when you consider your transient simulations as well, the reattachment of the flow to that DRS as well, it's got to be pretty instantaneous. So it's a mix of all of these different things. But it's also a case of getting that DRS to work with everything else. So, you have your beam wing at the rear, you've got the floor at the rear. Everything at the rear is pretty sort of interconnected in terms of aerodynamics. And if you're trying to reduce the drag of the rear wing, you're going to want to try and ensure that when you consider pressure changes and things like that, it's helping to either stall the beam wing or take a little bit of drag out of the rear diffuser. It's all of these sorts of things together in perfect harmony. So I think that's the key crux of why Red Bull is so strong there. They've clearly, done the assignment and have come up with a rear wing design and a DRS design that's able to pull that off altogether. So it is a remarkable feat. DRS has been in Formula One for 12 years, and that teams are finding more and more iterative gains with that, rather than it just being a flap that you move up and down like it probably, was considered as back in the day. It's no mean feat.
I don't know if you've seen, but I saw a quite interesting video recently by F1 aerodynamicist Wilhelm Todt, gave a lecture at Bolton University about F1 aerodynamics. It was fascinating for me, talking about molecules and structures and how downforce works and how it all interacts. And at the very end of it, he was asked about Red Bull and why he felt the car was so strong. This was last year's car, and he talked about ride being really important, that this stable platform was actually critical for allowing the aero to flourish. Matt, do you think there's more to kind of the performance of the car, and it's how Red Bull can use its aerodynamics rather than just what its aerodynamics are?
Yeah, as I mentioned off the bat, obviously you have to consider all the factors. And if we look at the dominance that's been asserted by teams in the past and the tools that they've adapted to not only improve ride but also platform compliance, which is what Willem's obviously talking about. We don't have many of those tools available anymore. Things like mass dampers, J dampers, inerters, frick, hydraulic suspension. We've gone through all of these iterations to help with the aerodynamic side of things to improve downforce and also obviously reduce drag. But even without those, the teams are now starting to look for ways to stabilise the aerodynamic platform. And obviously Red Bull have done a very good job in that respect. And obviously that rewards one of the most fundamental aspects of this particular rule change, which is obviously that the underfloor and the diffuser is prominent in producing downforce, whereas obviously we've had in the past, the wings have played a crucial role in that as well. So, I think Red Bull have just done a very good job in terms of their aerodynamic platform, but also, as we've mentioned earlier, the use of suspension elements to encourage those particular factors as well.
How important is the fact that Red Bull has this pushrod rear suspension as well? I've read a few comments from people suggesting that it allows kind of better packaging for freeing up space at the floor, a bigger diffuser, so is feeding the aero, even if there are some centre of gravity downsides to it. What are your thoughts on that, Jake? Are there gains to be had both aerodynamically and mechanically from it? Is it a question of compromise against the pull rod rear?
Well, in terms of, so let's kind of look at what a push rod rear suspension has in terms of its packaging. You're going to have the mounting brackets much further up. With a pull rod rear suspension, your toe elements, if you like, they're angled like this, they're angled kind of downwards. So you've got the connection point to the upright here, and you've got the mounting to the chassis kind of here. And so that's impinging on that space that you can use for, to, let's just say, have more freedom with regards to the Venturi tunnels underneath the car. So if you're able to move those brackets much further up and derive some kind of push rod rear suspension, then you've got that freedom and you're not having to create allowances for brackets and things like that. So it just kind of creates that freedom. But in terms of the actual suspension package altogether, as Matt has already alluded to, having everything working together is the absolute crux of this. It's why Red Bull is so strong. And when you're considering, what is suspension for, it's a truth that all objects in the known universe have, effectively, we can model them to have 6 degrees of freedom. And we want to try and limit that freedom because if you've got a car that's, it's rolling and it's pitching, the underbody is so sensitive with regards to Venturi tunnels that you're not producing the optimum amount of downforce. And so you're not able to tackle corners with the amount of confidence that you want. If you look at the GPS traces of a Red Bull, for example, you can see that it's really, really strong when, if you come to a sort of long radius corner, it's much, much more strong at the end. And that's because it's able to build up that downforce. And if you watch the car trackside, it's not rolling quite so much. It's definitely not pitching. If you look at the inclination of the front suspension, you can see that they're going for what one would consider to be some kind of anti-dive arrangement. It's something that you could theoretically work out yourself if you had the centre of gravity of the Red Bull. I don't think they're going to give up those numbers quite so easily, but it's this very, very clear trend to trying to limit this movement, this roll and dive in the car, so that you've got this very, very solid and stable platform for the underbody to work. It's something that Lotus tried in the past when we had the first iteration of ground effects, and they tried it with the Lotus 88, this dual chassis concept, by creating a very, very stiff kind of suspension for the aerodynamic underbody. You kind of had that situation where you could try and build up that downforce and not give such a harsh ride to the driver, and they'd be sort of in a relatively soft ride. So, it's been a truth for a very, very long time with regards to underbody aerodynamics, and Red Bull is just clearly doing a much better job of that relative to the other cars at the moment.
Matt, I read something from you recently talking about suspension tweaks at the front as well. I think the wheelbase has been extended, a bit more space at the front. What have Red Bull changed for this year, and why have they done it?
Well, they've changed a number of things. I think it's key, though, to remember that when we changed the regulations for 2022, Red Bull did adopt something very different to what they've had over the past. As Jake's just mentioned, obviously they repackaged the rear end, which means that they've got a push rod rear suspension and a pull rod front suspension. They've also carried over their mono-arm solution at the front of the car, which is very different to what we see other teams using as well. So although they've made changes this year, which is to do with the front axle, which has changed the wheelbase of the car, we have to consider, obviously, that they've built upon the success that they had with the RB18. Now, these changes that they've made for this year, which has meant that the front suspension elements have been swept rearward, also kind of relate to the fact that we've had changes to the construction of the Pirelli tyre. Now, there was a lot of talk last year from drivers that they were suffering from a lot of understeer with the old construction, and so changes were made to that. And then also, because of the way that the axle line has been moved forward, that also has impacts on the way that the aerodynamics work. So you think about the fact that that pushes the tyre further away from the likes of the underfloor and the side pods, and suddenly you've changed the wake profile of the way in which that interacts with the rest of the car. So I think Red Bull have learnt from what they had last year. They've taken into consideration the changes that have been imposed on them by the tyre manufacturer, and then obviously built on that to improve on the RB18.
Jake, where does ride height come into this as well? Because, you know, in the past, famously, we saw the Red Bull running very high rake cars to try and maximise performance out the back, but they seem to have shifted. Now, anyone who watches that car sees the plank bottoming out, sparks all over the place. Rivals talk about running much lower to the being able to run much lower to the ground than anyone else without it suffering porpoising. Why has it had this shift, and what's the advantage of being able to get that plank right down on the floor?
Well, it's something that everybody was chasing, wasn't it, last season, being able to try and run that car as low as possible. And as you say, everybody hit problems with regards to porpoising. And it just seems that with regards to that underbody stability, because the underbody is so sensitive, Red Bull just seems to have been able to kind of break up that sensitivity and has created something that has been able to go low to the ground. Obviously, it's very, very difficult to kind of give the crux of the reason why just by looking at the floor. But let's say what caused porpoising. There are lots of different theories, but largely, we can probably consider it some kind of frequency of oscillation that was affecting the underbodies of the other cars, that was, affecting the heave oscillation. And Red Bull managed to create a floor that, let's say, didn't bring the car within that window. And by creating that and ensuring that your car is able to run low to the ground, you don't have that problem. And you can do that by dialing out your suspension and that sort of thing. The reason for doing that is because you want your underbody to be working as efficiently as possible. And by getting the skirts closer to the ground, or what we consider to be skirts in modern day ground effects, so that would just be floor edges and all of the devices that they use to pen in the airflow underneath the floor, you're able to create masses and masses of downforce underneath. It is a big departure from what Red Bull used to do, because, as you say, they did have these very, very high rake cars. But I think that was more of a bonus for them, because they got used to using the floor edge, using aerodynamic devices in that part of the car to be able to create, some kind of vortices along the edge of the floor, or create some kind of aerodynamic patterns that ensured that any airflow underneath the car was relatively stable, wasn't going to spill out, or it wasn't going to let any kind of turbulence underneath the floor. So I think that set them up for this. And obviously, Red Bull has been able to reap the rewards of that.
Do you think it's also hurt the other teams in some respects, that losing those tools, that the other teams have kind of mastered it under the old system when they had more freedom, and now everyone's gone to these simple solutions, less complex, and they haven't been able to re-engineer what they had in the past?
I think so. I think one of the big differentiators between the teams, it has been purely in terms of knowledge. And, Matt said at the start, it's not just down to Adrian Newey being involved in the car. That's not why the car is so great. They've got, thousands of people at Red Bull HQ in Milton Keynes that are all equally responsible for the success. But I think when you consider having somebody like that on board, somebody with that experience and that knowledge, I think that's partly what it's down to. I don't necessarily think that losing all of those tools has been sort of the other team's problem. I think when you consider maybe Mercedes, the fact that they ran a low rake car for a very, very long time, I think perversely that's been worse for them in the long term. I just think it's having that knowledge to bank on. And the suggestions are in the paddock that Adrian Newey had a hand in the suspension effort of the Red Bull this year, rather than anything particularly involved aerodynamics and aerodynamics related. So I think that's, if true, quite telling. This is subjects that we explore. I'm just going to pop a little shameless plug in of Autosport magazine. We are going to look at the Red Bull in a little bit more depth, so look out for that in your local convenience store.
To both of you, we hear often in Formula One that there's no silver bullets to success, or the holy cows that Toto Wolff keeps talking about. But do you think the RB19 is proof of this, that there isn't one single element that stands out as key to its dominance? It's kind of a package of everything that is just slightly better in all areas that makes it stand out?
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the start, there's a lot of engineering that goes into a Formula One car, and Red Bull have clearly nailed most of those facets, but they did take an advantage into this new regulation set that they're obviously paying back whilst the others try to catch them up. And I'm sure that will slow Red Bull's progress in many respects. And I think it's also worth noting at this early stage that I think there's a bit of a tyre advantage situation going on. Red Bull seemingly have found something a little bit different compared to the other teams in terms of the way in which that they understand and extract performance from the tyres. And I think that will maybe alter slightly as we go into the course of the next few races, as Pirelli have obviously opted for more aggressive compounds up until Imola.
Jake, can you see any holy cows?
In Red Bull's design, well, we'll have to see how the rest of the season goes, to be honest with you. But it's looking very, very good. It's all going to be in the development now, and how that cost cap penalty, if it does come back to bite them, how it does come back to bite them, if at all. For example, I think Aston Martin have considerably more aerodynamic testing time compared to Red Bull until the 30th of June. So it's going to be really interesting to see if they're able to catch up with all of that extra testing time. But Red Bull's built an incredibly benign car with regards to handling. It just seems to be the complete package at the moment. So I struggle to see, if they're thinking about next year, what would be the first thing on the chopping block, because it all seems to work really well at the moment.
Thanks very much, guys. That's really interesting. I think it is going to be fascinating seeing just how long Red Bull's dominance can stay intact, because we can kind of get glimmers that the others are getting closer, then Red Bull pull away. But I think we need to see a bigger selection of circuits and see just what the opposition can roll out in terms of developments. We'll be back soon. Please hit the subscribe button below to keep us up to date with all the latest videos, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.